welcome to a special bonus episode of ABA Inside Track. Now, for those of you who know, typically on the show, we pick a topic and then we discuss relevant research articles. But what you may not know is that once a season, we host a book club discussion on our Patreon page. That's available to all patrons at the $10 and up level. However, we also like to do some bonuses around our book club when we can, including such fun activities as speaking to the authors. So this winter, our book club, as voted on by patrons, was Between Now and Dreams, Responsible and Responsive Parenting in Autism by Dr. Shala Rosales and Peggy Heinkel-Wolfe. And we're very fortunate in that we were able to get both of them to come on the show to talk about writing the book and reflecting on writing the book and answering some of my questions that I had while I read the book. So while some of you, everyone on the free feed is going to get a preview of what the book club would sound like in case you're interested in subscribing and hearing the whole thing. And certainly patrons will be able to hear the whole 2-hour discussion, including 2 CEs at no additional charge. Wink, 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 wink. Everyone will also get a chance to hear what Dr. Shala Rosales and Ms. Heinkel-Wolfe have to say about their own book. Because, hey, you may decide you want to read it and think for yourself about whatever content is in there instead of listening to us go on for 2 hours or whatever. And that's totally up to you. Either way, we really hope you enjoy this discussion with the authors of Between Now and Dreams. So I am talking with the authors of Between Now and Dreams, Dr. Shala Rosales and Peggy Heinkel-Wolfe. Thank you both so much for taking the time to talk with us about your new book. It's a couple months old now, right? It's still pretty new. That's pretty new for a book. I don't know how it works in book publishing.
Yeah, it's pretty new, and thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So why don't we start with some introductions? How did the two of you meet and decide, you know what, let's write a book, which is something that I assume is a very active and time-consuming process, right?
Yeah. In our case, it was over 10 years. And I'm not exaggerating.
No, she's not exaggerating.
No. Well, I do want to say one thing is that because we've done a couple of interviews and discussions about the book, and one thing I heard Dr. Ruha Benjamin say when someone was asking about, how did this all start, is there's so many different stories about how something started, the same thing. And so I think the lens of it can probably be changed in many ways, but maybe Peggy, if you're good, I'll just say a couple of things that I think were really important to me about the starting, our origin story. Peggy and I have been friends, I think, for now over 25 years. It's been a really long time. And we met, I think, originally, I was doing some work for a school district where Sam, Peggy's son, attended. And I was not working with Sam. I was doing some training and met Peggy's family in that process. And then over the course of time, we actually never had a really service provider, clinician, client relationship, but we worked from the very beginning. I think we thought together a lot, and we talked about the ideas and what was going on in the world of autism, in the world of parenting, in the world of treatment. And I think from the very beginning, I remember really deep conversations in parking lots and at swimming pools and in backyards. And as time went on, we engaged in some projects together, which maybe Peggy can tell you more, but toy lending libraries, programs in terms of interactions with people with autism and the police, and working. Peggy's really active in parent to parent, and so doing some work with parent to parent as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. But it was after the parent to parent workshop we did on decision making, I think, that we started talking about the idea that this could be a little book that might help parents think about what's going on, learn about what they need to learn about, and to be stronger, in stronger positions to support their kids. And so we started like periodically meeting and started writing, and, life would happen and we would stop. But also, as we interacted with different audiences, we got feedback about what we were writing, and things changed quite a bit over time. And then the world started changing quite a bit over time. Both our worlds as, mothers, wives, daughters, that all changed a lot. And the pandemic, of course. So what I really love, and then I'll stop, what I really love is we never felt like an urgency to produce something. What we felt was an urgency to speak this shared truth that we were developing together, and a very provisional truth, but we really worked hard to develop a voice that was bigger than either of our voices alone. And that, I don't know, Peggy, if you like this or not, but I always talk about it as kind of this grandmother place, because it was feeling like we were accumulating a lot of experience, both as professionals, not only as a behavior analyst as a profession, but Peggy's a journalist. So she was seeing a lot and doing a lot of stories. And anyway, so we were always okay with that process and always okay with the amount of time it took. I don't know. I'll hand it over to you. I don't know if that answered very well, but
I think so. And Peggy, please share your half, because I know that's all this book is both of your halves.
Oh, Shala did that pretty well. I honestly don't remember the first time we met, and I think that happens a lot in your life. People just come into your life and they're in your life. Maybe the only time you tell the story of how we met is like, your first boyfriend or something like that. So, but I love that if I search my memory, I can't find it. I love that. She's just always been in my life.
I actually feel quite emotional about some things that we're talking about. Like I find myself starting to cry thinking about like what Peggy just said.
Oh, it was very well said, Peggy.
I just wanted to underscore that even though, sorry, Shala never was providing services to our family, except there was one little link up when Sam was in second grade and needed, that's another story, best told over a beer. But she was a touchstone for me when I was thinking. And I can't tell you how important that is when you're a parent and you're trying to make meaning out of chaos, to have someone in your life who is listening to you, not just to be empathetic and but to actually like kind of steer your thinking in a direction that's going to change what's happening in your world. It's I think parents need that kind of person in their life too. You don't just need the person who shows up to toilet train your child. You need the person to help you think about the world in ways that maybe you're not thinking about. And I can think of, Shala isn't the only person, but there have been people along the way who have changed how we thought about things. And that made all the difference in the kinds of opportunities and advancements that Sam was able to make, because we broke the frame that was holding things together and made a new frame that was bigger and wider and more beautiful.
And that definitely works both ways. I think because of the nature of our relationship and our friendship, we could talk about things and they may or may not have been related to autism. They could have been about, like we talk about breastfeeding, in the book, but they always went beyond I don't know, beyond a tip about something. There was always a connection about meaning and about how it's placed in the bigger picture. I think Peg and I both like to think that way. And so I think that we want practical, we want something done, and we always want to think about what that means and how it fits with everything else, you know, from racism to, I don't know, beautiful artwork, whatever it is. Like, we always wanted to see what all the connections were and had those discussions. So at a personal and a professional level, I think we had the kind of friendship that always helps you expand your awareness and your capacity in the universe. And that has always been really beautiful.
Well, that definitely, I think hearing you both talk about your relationship and your friendship and sort of that additive effect that it's had on both of your lives, it definitely comes through in the book itself. And I think a lot of the kind of undercurrents that go through the book, or at least I thought, you know, went through the book. I do want to talk a little bit about where you're hoping this book would go in terms of, you know, the big theme or the big take homes that you were hoping everyone got out of it. Because I was really surprised, because Shala, you mentioned that the book was coming out when you came on the show to talk about some of your research, and when it was kind of chosen as our sort of parenting book for our book club for the winter, I was really excited to get a chance to read it. And I was struck by how it was not the parenting book I don't know what I thought it was going to be, but it wasn't the parenting book I assumed would be a parenting book. Because usually you think of a parenting book and it's like chapter 1, how to toilet train, like chapter 2, discipline issues. And you just expect it to be, here's your checklist of activities you should do, you know, informed by behavior analytic research and informed by experience and things that worked and didn't work. And that is not what this book is at all. And I found that very refreshing. But it did sort of leave me thinking at various times, like, what? I'm curious what, at the end of the day, you're really hoping, like, this is what I want everyone who reads this book to get from here. This is the goal of writing a whole book about this subject. So I would just love to hear from both of you kind of what that overall goal was. Because I know it wasn't to check the boxes of here's how to parent, you know, a child with autism or an autistic child. That was not the goal. I can tell that.
All right. Well, for some reason, this isn't my first book. My first book was See Sam Run, which was a memoir of the first 4 years of his life. And for some reason, Shala read the book and got something out of it that that was not why I wrote what I wrote. And it made me think about how everyone does this. You open a book. I mentioned this in my introduction, and you read it and it becomes a part of your life and it changes your life because you read it and you made it a part of your life. So my hope for this book is that there was enough open-ended discussion and enough research and enough thoughtfulness that no matter who you are, when you read the book, you're going to take away things that will change your life.
That was very beautifully said. I guess I'm going to ride on that. I think at least, well, first of all, I think what Peg said is that we see in works, whether it's literature or essays or paintings or music, that the person who produced those may have, I'm going to use behavioral speak since we're speaking to behavior analysts, but they may have certain stimulus controls or reinforcers when that work is produced. But then how the effect and how that is interacted with by people with different experiences, positions, different stimulus controls and reinforcers, that's going to vary a lot. And I think that I'm also a painter, so I'm going to go with that metaphor a little bit. But I think, for example, if I'm painting something and I'm really, there's something about my experience, my skills in that subject matter, and I produce a work of art, this isn't a very clear way of talking about it, but there's some truth in what I did that people will respond to in their own ways. And I think as we were working on it, there were several truths that were just inherent to both Peggy and I's experience and who we are. One of them was that at least as well as I understood behavior analysis and the research in behavior analysis, that I explained that in a way that contextualizes it, gives it meaning, and makes it relevant. I think, based on my truth of families I've been working with for over 30 years. So it may or may not be someone else's truth, but as closely as possible, it was my understanding of this work I've been doing for 30 years. And the other truth was that both of our lenses together would produce something else, something bigger than both of us. And then that truth is what we constantly struggled to give voice to. And that voice, we always have been talking to parents, and we've always been talking from my perspective, probably especially, we've been always talking to parents knowing that behavior analysts are listening to the conversation. So that's kind of, I think, what we were doing in that process. Probably one of the biggest compliments that we probably hit that was from Bill Heward, who I admire so much, not only as a scholar and a writer, but as a human being. Like, his work and the work that their groups have done, I think it hits the sweet spot of science and compassion in ways I just have always admired. So when he talked about, reading the book and his impressions, and I think he's written us some reviews, that I thought, oh, we did it. We actually gave voice to the thing we were trying to give voice to. But I also think I've had discussions with people, and like Peggy with her book and my reaction, people have said, oh, I thought this, and this. I'm like, oh, I didn't even know we were saying that, but that's nice. Good. So yeah, I think it's an interesting thing because it is very different than the kind of work you were talking about that, this is how to toilet train your child. These are 15 variations. This is troubleshooting, which are really good books. Like those books have been important both to Peggy and I for all kinds of things in our parenting and professional lives. But that wasn't really, and we talk about that actually. We even have a section about how parents need both checklists and protocols as well as foundational kind of deeper knowledge that helps them navigate and navigate what I think are really complex parenting conditions, probably more complex than they were, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
It did seem in some ways like this book was for almost like the parents who are ready to move past the checklist. Like maybe they're either tired of reading the checklist books or the how-to books, or they just really wanted to find a deeper understanding and meaning to what it is to be a parent. I definitely found that there was much more discussion of some of the the key concepts that I think are important both to parents and should be, if they're not already, important to behavior analysts, that just really just kind of resonated throughout the book. And you both came back to some of those themes. I think one of the metaphors used was the idea of the recipe. We think of the checklist as kind of that recipe, and then the idea of the poison recipe, and the difference between just I'm just going to follow the recipe and here's how it's going to produce terrible food in terms of the care and the treatment, and then here's the good recipe where you take the recipe as just one component of the overall piece that goes into making the meal. The meal's not just I followed the recipe; it's everything else that goes into it. So I didn't have a question there. I just really liked those metaphors. A lot of good food and meal metaphor. I think I actually was telling someone the other day something about just the idea of the joy of having a meal and not just being, here's your reinforcer for eating the new food that you took a bite of escargot, so now you get, a Twizzler piece or whatever. Just that's not what it's about. And I know I found those sections to be great. I do know I have some colleagues that I think would read this book and see it as kind of that next level of looking at behavior analysis and looking at parenting. I have some I think might struggle because maybe they're not quite at that point in their career, understanding all of the basics part. Was that something that you thought of in terms of the parents who might read this book, that you want it to be scientific, you want it to be based in research, but if you just make it a science book, it's no longer for all the parents that might read it. But if you don't put any science in, it is devaluing so much of what you are, talking with parents about in terms of their ability to be a very important member of a team, that they are going to have to become scientists if there aren't already scientists. I mean, was that a worry? Like, what's the right balance so that you're not off-putting, but you're not condescending? And if so, how did you feel you were able to resolve that?
I think in some ways you're describing our writing process. So I'm coming at Shala with ways to say things in plain language. I'm coming at her with, this sounds like this sounds like that, which isn't to say that Shala didn't come up with analogies. She did all the time. But I think we realized pretty early on that there's power in describing material that way because it makes it relatable, but it also makes room to think, because you break the mold that you're in and imagine other possibilities. I don't know if I'm making sense at all, but I know that there were times when I would be writing and kind of starting to explore that way, and Shala would reel me back in to make sure we were being precise and accurate, and not being fanciful. And I wasn't ever interested in being fanciful either. I wanted to be precise and powerful and grounded in the science, because that is how you make progress. But anyways, Shala's got thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think I want to go back to the describing our writing process, because exactly what you just talked about, we had long discussions about. And that is part of that whole checklist session where we talk about that, because we got feedback and we have our own interactions about how much to say, this is what you should do, parents. But the truth is, there isn't a one what you should do, parents. And it's getting more and more complicated. But I don't think it's just this. I think that tension is reflected in the field in general. There's a lot about rigid protocols, flexible protocols. There's a lot about, cookie cutter programs. There's a lot about what autistic people should or shouldn't do, so there's all these binaries about it should be one way or the other. And I think this is not just our field. I think it's the world. And I don't know all the reasons why, but there's so much information and we're hearing the voices of so many different people. So there's more perspective, there's more information. And I think the tendency to just say, just tell me what to do, and to close in becomes greater and greater when there's all that information. But kind of what we know, and at least our understanding in life, is that if you can be directional and because Peggy and I'm going to brag a little, I think we're both really good cooks. We talked a lot about Julia Child. but part of being a good cook is knowing, yes, some really basic recipes, knowing the conditions under which you modify and extend them and expand them, how they go with other things, and also understanding a little bit of the chemistry and who you're feeding, like all of that. So all those metaphors around food, I think we're also really useful because metaphors are a good teaching tool, but they also help us think through the complexity of something. And I think that the complexity of being both responsible and responsive to your child at this moment in time requires some, and that is why we focus on those three things. It requires learning. We all have to be in learning mode, all of us. We have to be like learning from each other and connecting and helping each other. And we have to keep love at the center. Like those three things we really thought deeply about. Okay. And again, in behavioral terminology, what are three really cuspal things that will help people think and move through all of this? And not to say that there aren't recipes or checklists. Like we absolutely, and we talk about this thing, one book's not going to do everything for a family. But we hope that this one book will be something families can dip in and out of to help them find direction, find movement, and make meaning of what it is they're going through. But that tension is a big one.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the makeup of the book, you have your three sections, learning, the power of learning, connecting, and the power of love. And, each one's sort of covering a slightly different facet of the overall parenting picture, though certainly coming back to some of the same themes throughout. I know one theme that I was picking up on, and perhaps I was just, again, I was definitely reading this book as like, well, I'm a behavior analyst and I'm reading this from the clinical perspective. I'm not necessarily not the audience, but I'm also not exactly the audience of the book. And I definitely came up with the theme, certainly of collaboration. And certainly I think that did a lot for, hey, parents, you can work with behavior analysts, and here are some signs of, a good behavior analyst who wants to work with you. This is what you should be looking for. And here's a sign of ones that might not be sort of doing their best collaboration. I'm curious, because I think for both of you, you could have come at it from multiple perspectives. Was that mostly for the benefit of parents to understand what would make a good collaborator in terms of a clinician? Or was any of it sort of like, I was talking to a BCBA the other day, and the way they were talking about billing or the way they were talking about services just like ground my gears, and like I'm putting them on blast in this chapter. Like where was the main thrust in those sections of the book?
I think it was for parents. I think, keep in mind, Peggy and I in our early 60s. So we were around for that history we described. And what we saw early on, when people understood you could teach and make important changes, you can intervene and really great things would happen. What we saw early on is parents were up at the front, and, it was uncomfortable. And sometimes it seemed really unfair that they had to do all this learning and had to be such knowledgeable, strong advocates. But that also was a really important function. As services became much more available, which is really good. I think this is a transition period. But as services became more available, parents felt, and what it felt like is they took a deep breath and moved back. And more distance grew. And we talk about this in great detail in the book. But that is hard because you have an important stakeholder, an important voice, and an important person who really is going to be with the child the rest of their life, not just a year or two. And to have that person be removed or the family be removed, it's like taking something apart and only thinking that one piece is important. So I do hope it didn't feel like we were slamming anyone, because we really tried to focus on the systems are in flux. When you join the healthcare system, at least in this country, it's a really complicated thing in terms of the finances, the billing, the structures, even the places where people receive services. So I think because autism interventions are new in that milieu, I think that it's producing things that we should name and we should try to understand, and we should try to to figure out how to keep a whole child and their family at the center and not have pieces of children. And that is a really challenging thing because that happens in all realms of our healthcare system. Mm-hmm. So again, it's not a unique thing, but the only person or people who are even possibly seeing all the vantage points are the families. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
And sometimes the systems are really overwhelming for parents. I don't have to go far into our family's experience at all. I can come up with a big laundry list of situations where I was one of a sea of experts sitting around a table, and it's very hard to speak up in those kinds of situations. And I think it's important for parents to be reminded that they are the ones that have all this expertise and knowledge. They might not have an alphabet soup of initials by their name, but maybe we should give them some. I don't know.
I like that.
Well, Peggy, that makes me think of, I know in some of the section, I believe it was the kind of the section on connecting, there was some research that was described by Heather Barahona. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah.
I believe that was the section. I can't remember if it was her idea, if it was part of that section, the IEP bookmark, which I know you can get a template from the website. I saw that the other day. Thank you for sharing that. And talking about the idea of some parent training on, hey, these are some skills related to communication and advocacy, because it is such a hard skill. I mean, it's a hard skill for anyone, but as a parent, that sense of, if I don't speak up, I might not get my own needs or my child's needs met the way that I would be happy with. But if I speak up too much, are people going to think, oh, this parent, what a pain. Like, I don't have time for all of this, and maybe decrease, the amount of power they give me, or take power away because they're annoyed through my actions. And I was really curious about whether there was, you speak about it a lot in the book, but that line of research specifically, I think I found Heather's dissertation online, and I was looking through it, but it seemed like that should be so ripe for way more research on helping parents, feel more empowered in their communication abilities at those tough clinic meetings or IEP meetings or planning meetings. I mean, am I just missing it? I just couldn't find it? Or is that something that's in need still?
There was a burst of funding for that type of research, I think in the late 80s, 90s. And in fact, it was her master's thesis, was a replication of Core-Nephin Parish. It was a study in Java for families whose children were medically had some kind of medical issues. So there were families from all different positions. So Heather, who's also a parent of two kids with autism, well, now they're grown up, but so she had experienced all that herself, and together we crafted a training program for families to help them be able to navigate those systems when you're sitting with a bunch of people with a whole bunch of alphabet around you and you don't have it, but you need to help them remember, this is my person who I love very much, and I am here to advocate and to support them. And I think, you know what? Professionals get that. I also think it helps to be reminded the parent's not being annoying. They're not being demanding. They love this child, and they want to figure out what the best thing to do is for them. And a room full of people is a little intimidating. So part of what Heather worked on was that. Heather went on to open a school, to do many things, to teach other people. And I know, through the people in our lab, that was replicated. We have not submitted it, or it's not been accepted for publication. And she's working on her PhD right now. So that hasn't been a primary thing. But there has been work in special education, a lot. And Parent to Parent, the group that Peggy's really involved with, they do a lot of teaching parents many strategies for being engaged. But that is primarily, the research has been done through and funded, I think, primarily through IDEA. which is education. It's not the healthcare system. So advocacy within the healthcare system is an area that hasn't happened. And I think it probably would be a really ripe area for lots of research and practice to be developed about how patients, families, clients can advocate for care and for optimal care in the healthcare system. I don't know if you want to add to that, Peg.
Oh, I agree. I just had an experience yesterday with the healthcare system that it was like, wow, I'm glad I had experience with the special education system because we actually had some responsiveness today because I knew what to do. So I do think there might be a difference between research and then technology transfer. It's the kind of thing where you've trained one parent and you've trained one parent, and then their kid grows up, and then you've got a whole bunch of new parents. I am surprised sometimes when I'm sitting in on one of our advocacy meetings. It's like, oh, wow, here's another young parent saying the same things I said 20 years ago. How come we don't? Although part of me goes, why is it necessary? There's a part of my social justice skeleton that says, why do we have to train parents and loved ones of patients to be advocates? Why are our systems so difficult that we have to train people to be advocates? Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, that is an incredibly important point. And I think something we all need to think about a lot is that why is the parent having to be in a position to fight?
Yeah, it's often adversarial, adversarial, and profoundly adversarial. Like lawyers making careers off of this adversarialness.
Well, and even just the talk you hear about patients behind the scene. I mean, I was in a situation, I have some ongoing health problems, and my doctor actually said to me, well, for you overeducated problem patients, I thought, I'm just asking questions about how this medication interacts with my other medication. But there's an adversarial structure set up, and I think the analysis of that and how to change it, I think would be, and it gets worse. The more under-resourced you are, the less clout you have walking in, the more diminished you are in the systems. And I think that is something to think about deeply, which we talk about. There are a lot of sections where I think Peggy and I would talk through something, and then we would say, yeah, it's these individual players, but it's also the system. And that's on us as a society to understand having all these pieces competing and letting so many people fall through the cracks is a problem. And that as a society, we have to think about that. And it's not just in this area, it's in so many realms.
I do believe that the book did a very nice job, though, kind of capturing that need for the individuals involved in these communities, in these groups, to have that understanding, but also understanding of, and while it would be great if it were, it's not quite. So here are the other skills, but never choosing one or the other. I know that's a balance that I see a lot. I mean, I work in school systems of that. Wouldn't it be great if, specifically speaking for, say, like our autistic adolescents, wouldn't it be great if we just created, communities or school communities that had a better understanding of, the variety of interests and ways of socializing? Yes, but we don't. So we got to teach these individual skills and teach kids how to mask or be normal. And it's so frustrating because it's not like either one that's the right or the wrong answer. It's sort of that we're going to move towards one, but in the meantime, here's where we're going to shore up situations specifically to help the individual get what they want out of life rather than just make them normal. And I think that's a very hard dichotomy to explain. I think it's a very hard dichotomy to teach to. I can't imagine what it was like to have to then, write sections of a book where you have to sort of explain to some extent both viewpoints without getting too deep into one versus the other. We talked about that a lot in terms of just some of the kind of the needs of your audience. Is, did you ever find that you were veering towards one answer, versus another answer, and then had to pull back and just kind of try to find a more central ground? Or was that something that you just had so much time talking about this and you're living it that you just kind of, no, it was easy, no problem for us. We're pros.
No, it wasn't easy. And I will tell you, I think actually that's the whole point of the book. I think the whole point of the book is there are so many dichotomies and there are so many binaries and there are so many things that feel opposing to parents. And part of what we were trying to do was to show ways to harmonize and coordinate. Being even the subtitle, responsible and responsive parenting, is those two things can look opposing. However, if you think that there's a third thing above them and harmonize them, they go together really well. And I think that even like what's happening, pieces of children in the healthcare system, pieces of children in the education system, the clinicians have this point of view, the parents have this point of view. If you try to look at, well, how can we harmonize and understand that? I think we're going to be more likely to build third ways, new ways of, yes, how can we serve the child as a whole? How can we understand the families in a system? They're in their tide pool. Like, how can we pay attention to all of that? And I think part of our truth, back to what we were talking about in the beginning, was exploring what looked like opposing forces and trying to understand something bigger, and at the same time, give advice about, okay, here's how to try to make it work under these conditions. But you have to kind of understand what the conditions are. And so part of what we were exploring was that, and giving a model of our exploration, I think. Maybe that did not make sense. I don't know, Peggy, if you can say any of that better, but...
No. Sometimes Shala's just too brilliant for me. So I'll probably get to this part of the podcast and roll over it several times and go, oh my God.
Yeah, but sometimes I'm also just going off in my la-la land and thinking out loud, and then everybody's confused. So I don't, maybe it was confusing.
Well, I think in a way that is the way that my family has tried to live our lives. You can start with the dichotomies of when they're toddlers and they don't get the cues that other toddlers do to toilet train. And then all of a sudden you've got to do this plan because you're thinking, well, I could change diapers. I don't mind changing diapers. I did it for the first 3 years. I can do it for 3 more years. But then you realize you really can't do that. You've got to figure out a way to cusp this, and then that's you do more and more and more of that every time you get to a new plateau in their life, and you're thinking, okay, this is the dichotomy we're living in. And then you try to put another layer up. At some point, I feel really lucky or blessed or whatever. I don't know what the adjective is, but at some point, I think my son came to recognize that about himself. He's got more self-awareness than I have of myself. But now he looks for the building places. So, and he also knows when the world is afraid of him and acts accordingly. It's sad to see, but he wants to survive like everybody else. So he does it. He does what he has to do to move like the gentle giant that he is.
One thing that I was curious about in reading the book was, is there, kind of thinking about services, behavioral analytics services, evidence-based practice. There's a lot of discussion about evidence-based practice and sort of the difference between the fact that something is an evidence-based practice that doesn't just mean just do what it says, do the checklist. There's a lot more to it in terms of paying attention to context, paying attention to the family values. And I was struck by an anecdote in the book, and I believe, Peggy, it was in reference in when you were working on like requesting with Sam, and that idea of, well, if he didn't say the word or didn't use the right phrase, don't give. I believe it was a cookie, or it was some sort of treat. And how you recognized very quickly that you'd overstepped. He wasn't quite ready for the specific wording that was being used in the request. And I was just struck by how that seems like the sort of, realization that only either a parent or a behavior analyst who's sort of just been doing this for a long time and has seen all the variations could come to. Because I still remember, when thinking about evidence-based practice, communication training, it's so easy, right? You hold the appetitive item and you model the phrase and you wait. And if you don't hear the phrase, well, that item ain't coming out, to the child or to the individual. They can't have it, and you have to wait. And if they get mad, well, that's just going to get them more motivated to use the phrase. And how it took me years to realize that, I can't just follow that checklist. Like, that's upsetting the child. They're not going to speak to me if I'm upsetting them. That's upsetting the family. They don't want to see their child crying and screaming. And it's not really making me any happier either. So I was sort of wondering in hearing that anecdote, I kind of wanted to just hear from both of you as you were writing it. Were there specific, evidence-based practices that you were thinking of that you were like, I want this to reflect that there are some practices that just aren't, you can't just do them without so much more context in them? Like, were there ones that you specifically had in mind, when you were writing sections like that, or when you were writing the book? Like, behavior analysts, if you're just going to do things by the checklist, don't do this one.
I want to jump in here and make sure there's in your question, there's a little bit of an assumption of what was happening in the writing process there. Sometimes, and don't be. It was a beautiful thing to do, and I could just let you go and not be honest, but I'm about to be really honest here. So sometimes we'd be talking about a concept we'd want to get across in the book. And I would say to Shala, that's like when this happened in my life, I think. And then we would talk about it and she would give meaning. So some of the meaning of that situation was not readily apparent to me when it was happening. I knew it wasn't working, and I wasn't going to keep doing something that wasn't working and was upsetting my kid. I was going to try to figure out some other way to get there. Was that evidence-based? Well, for me, no, it was not. I was just responding to my child as a loving parent would respond to their child. But as Shala's, trying to get concepts across, and then I go, well, gosh, that's like when I was raising Sam and this happened. Then all of a sudden, you have this whole vignette that opens up, that you have an experience. It has meaning. It has understanding. In some ways, I feel really lucky that I got to work with Shala so that I could reframe all these horrible experiences in my life with better meaning. But I also made the right choice, so I'm going to give myself credit for that. All right, go ahead, Shala. Now you can put the science and evidence-based and all that on top of it.
No, it's all of it. It's I love one of my advisors, Dr. Jim Sherman. He talked about lemonade a lot, and he talked about community a lot. And the thing is, all this stuff in life happens. We have wonderful things happen. We suffer. We have all these events, and sometimes we have a role in them. Sometimes we're watching them. But whatever they are, the degree to which we can learn from them and connect with other people and talk about them, and people who have different levels and of expertise and experience. So Peggy had those experiences, and sometimes they were things that happened in the past, and we would talk about them, and then we would link them to other stories that happened to both of us. But like in that particular, in the cookie, that actually, I think as a clinician and a scholar in behavior analysis, I recognized she was already doing some really important things. The first signal to her of whether something was working or not was Sam's distress. And I think it should be the signal for all of us. Like, learners should not be distressed. That is a flag for lack of reinforcement. The skills are too big, a whole group of things. So that's also why we emphasize the loving part is trust your love for your child. If your child, and it doesn't mean your child's not going to be distressed, because that's also something parents need to learn is, like, for me as a parent, suffering in my children is horrible. And my parenting errors all tend to be towards not setting limits or saying yes too much. I know that about myself. But in this situation, and in all situations, the emotions are like flags. They let us know about what's going on with the contingencies. So as Peggy's describing that, I could say, oh, this is from my behavior analytic point of view. I would look at what's happening with the contingencies there. And then I might say some things about your instinct was right. Step back, reevaluate how you're doing it. And this is also where the responsibility and responsiveness come up. You can teach your child to communicate what they like and want, don't want, all of that. You are being a responsible parent, because life is a lot better if you have agency through your words. Absolutely. At the same time, being responsive, you know what? If it's not working, step back, break it down more. Don't take something so precious, or don't put it in terms of we're going to battle, kid. Put it in terms of, I want you to be able to do this. Maybe just point in the beginning so I can show you what this game of communicating with each other is about. But that is where the science that we've developed that tells us something about shaping, how to break things down, and how to do it in a way where the organism doesn't run away. In graduate school, I had to learn to shape rats. And I worked in a rat lab. I worked in a pigeon lab. And one of the things my teacher and the lab professor told us, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but if the rats are pooping a lot, or they're doing all these weird behaviors, it means you're not doing a good job. You are causing distressed rats. Your shaping steps are too big. They're not getting access to it. Once I saw that, and I love those little rats. I had names for them all. Like, it was, and the pigeons, but I started looking at everybody in life and seeing all of us do the equivalent of like pooping too much in different ways. Sometimes it's like, hurting each other or hurting ourselves or whatever. But that distress is something all parents and all clinicians should be on high alert for. If you have anyone doing that, it means change what you're doing. And that's where connecting comes in. Go find some people who can help you figure out how to change it, or figure it out by learning. And that's why we focused on the principles and the process in what we were writing about. Step back and, like the cooking, think about, okay, in cooking, we think about what's the chemistry here. In behavior analysis, we think about what are the principles of learning here, and how do we figure out how to adapt what we're doing. But interestingly, and Peggy brings this up with another example about imitation and teaching Sam to imitate. She actually started doing something that I think it was Brooke Ingersoll did some of the first research on reciprocal imitation training. She actually started doing some of that, which some of, I believe, Ingersoll's work is also based on some work in child development, but there's so many spheres of knowing, and there's so much going on that we can all learn from each other. But we got to use how that baby's telling us it's either working or not working as our first line of what to do or not do.
I love it when she says things like what that baby's telling us. I mean, yeah. They're so communicative. You just have to listen. You have to
learn to observe. Like,
yeah.
I don't think any of us, behavior analysts, anyone, have learned to be very observant or responsive to emotions or the relationship of how people are behaving in their environment. Like that, those are kind of high level skills.
I know we're getting close to our time together, so I wanted to make sure I had one or two more questions I wanted to make sure we had time for. I mean, one that I think I'm always fascinated about, and we've already talked a little bit about it in terms of just the overall, the writing process. But if you did have to pick one lesson, like you had the magic wand and you could say, I hope everyone who reads this book puts it down and says, now I know blank. I'm going to be a better parent, clinician, whoever's reading the book, both, because I learned blank. What would that kind of, core lesson, cuspal lesson perhaps be? Again, if you could force that upon the world, not that you're trying to, but I'm just if you could have your way in that level of control over what's in the book.
Always with the love. Always with the love. That'd be my thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's sort of the animating force. It's also the thing that helps us change direction when it's gone off, as long as we keep that. I do think, and I don't know why, but one of the stories that always speaks to me is the story of Connie. And it's not the most complicated or research based, but it's such a beautiful whole example. And I think it's only like 3 paragraphs long, but I think from start to finish, it's a really good example of all 3 powers of learning, of connecting, and of loving. And I think it also is a really genuine, heartfelt story of love. It's a love story. And I think that story, whenever I think about it, it's probably always one of the most salient stories for me.
And you have to read the book to know what she's talking about with Connie.
There's a lot of good stories in there and a lot of learning, I think. But I agree with Peggy. I think the take home probably is, if you can take home only one thing, love is probably the thing to take home.
I'm sure you're hoping there's more than one thing taken home, but
Yeah. I actually kind of reread through the book before we had this meeting or this discussion. And I think what struck me was both the simplicity and complexity of the book, and that on one hand, how could I explain this thing that it's kind of like, I don't want to say this, it's going to sound really bad, but it's kind of like the first time I went to the National Gallery in London, I saw a Van Gogh, like for real. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I was in tears. And I don't think I could explain to you why I was in tears. And I'm not saying our book is a Van Gogh, but it's kind of like there are certain things that it's also the experience. And I remember Peggy and I talking about this. And you know what? I can't remember the name of the book, Peggy, but it was one that you loved a lot. It was a really thick book. And you talked about how you didn't really read the whole thing, but you kind of went in and out of it at different times. And we talked about this book maybe ending up as something like that you might read through it, but then you revisit it and it'll have a different impact on you. I'm trying to remember which book. It was a parenting book.
Was it Randall Colton Rolfe's book, You Can Postpone Anything But Love?
Oh yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that came up in discussion as we were working on the book that, wow, this is a lot.
It was. It is.
I still think it's a little too long, to be honest. But I'm not sure what we would do with it. But anyway, yeah. I have to say, it's just been really delightful talking to you about this, because you're interacting with the book in ways that I don't know, that we kind of meant it to be interacted with or thought about. So it's
Yes,
it's
thank
nice. Yeah. And you've made us think a lot. I'm sure we'll have lots of
I may have read the book
discussions.
wrong, I don't know.
No, it's been good. You've given me a lot to think about, and I think you've also helped us be able to talk about it. You know, it's an interesting thing writing a book. I mean, Peggy writes all the time and talks about what she does all the time, but I think for behavior analysts, it is a very different book. It's not like other books.
We want to say big thanks to Dr. Shala Alai Rosales and Peggy Heinkel-Wolfe for coming on and talking all about Between Now and Dreams. I know I had a lot of fun having read the book. Getting a chance to discuss it with the authors is such a treat, and I hope that this has either wet your whistle to read the book yourself, or perhaps has given you a chance to reflect on the book if you have already read it. Now, certainly you can purchase this book everywhere. It's on Amazon, all those great places. I don't know if it's in local bookstores, if you can find one of those, right? But if you're not quite sure if the book is for you, well, maybe you want to hear our winter book club where me and Diana and Jackie and Alan get together, and possibly some of our listeners get together to discuss the book at length. That's actually going to be coming out very soon, so it should be out probably a couple days after this one in your feed. If you are a free subscriber, you'll get a preview, and if you want to hear the whole discussion, again, that's 2 hours devoted to talking about this book, and 2 CEs for no additional charge, just for saying thank you for being a subscriber. Head on over to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track and sign up at our premium $10 level to get access to that right away when it comes out. Or, hey, you can just enjoy the book and have your own thoughts and send us an email with what you thought about the book. We'd really love to hear how you interpreted the books. I think there's a lot of great stuff in here that's open to a different interpretation depending on who you are and your community of practice and where you are in your career and who you are as a parent. A lot of things that can kind of, I think, go into a good discussion of the concepts brought up in the book. We really enjoyed it as a group. I'm speaking for the group, but I know I certainly really enjoyed it. And we hope you really enjoyed this bonus episode. So keep an eye out for the full winter book club. We'll have another poll coming up for patrons for our spring book club in about a month or so. It's coming up fast. But until then, you can get our normal episodes coming up every week. And until then, keep responding. Bye.